10 names, 10 crimes, one state on edge. Tonight we count down the most infamous women across Texas who planned, stalked, and killed fetal abductions built on fraud, murder for hire in parking garages, jealousy erupting into gunfire, scenes staged as break-ins, dates, places, methods, motives, verdicts. Listen closely. The pattern is calculation, not chaos. Case 1. Taylor Renee Parker. Taylor Renee Parker was a young woman from Northeast Texas who constructed a pregnancy out of words, props, and persistence. Friends saw ultrasound photos, heard due dates, and watched a belly grow under maternity clothes. Parker described doctors, appointments, and plans. It was a performance carried over months, a story told so often that it demanded a final scene. Prosecutors later said the ending she chose was not birth. It was theft. On the morning of October 9th, 20 in New Boston, Bowie County, 21-year-old Reagan Simmons Hancock was at home in late pregnancy. She knew Parker. The visit seemed ordinary. Inside minutes, the room turned surgical. Parker attacked with a blade-like instrument, inflicting dozens of sharp force injuries and catastrophic blood loss. She cut into Reagan's abdomen and removed the fetus and improvised cesarean in a private house, without anesthesia, without sterile tools, without any chance for the mother to live. Neighbors would later tell investigators about the quiet of that hour, the still air before the sirens. Parker left with the newborn wrapped in blankets and drove away from the scene, along the rural highways running toward Oklahoma. She began to assemble a new lie that she had just given birth on the roadside. First responders encountered her soon after. They worked the infant, moved fast, and transferred the child to a hospital in Idabel, Oklahoma. The baby was pronounced dead. Parker's account of labor on the highway could not withstand basic observation. No signs of a recent delivery, no medical records, no plausible timeline. Back in New Boston, officers entering Reagan's home found a crime scene that read like a set of instructions: blood patterns, cut marks, a ruptured abdomen, and a trail that led straight to the woman now claiming motherhood. The investigation showed months of premeditation. Digital forensics pulled search histories about cesarean sections, blood loss, and ways to simulate pregnancy. Messages documented a carefully curated persona, ultrasound images shared with relatives, baby showers discussed, delivery dates chosen. Witnesses described how Parker shaped and reshaped the narrative when questions appeared. The state argued that she selected a target who was close at hand and late in term, a victim she could visit without raising alarm. The objective, they said, was fetal abduction, kill the mother, seize the infant, and complete the fiction. Evidence linked Parker to the house at the relevant time, cell site data, travel records, and statements converged. The physical story was even stronger. Investigators documented incisions across Reagan's abdomen consistent with an attempted surgical extraction. They photographed defensive wounds and signs of a violent struggle. Blood soaked into flooring, and furniture traced the path of the attack. In the car Parker was driving, officers found blood and items that tied back to the victim. The gaps in her explanation grew larger with every piece of lab work. Parker was charged with capital murder and related counts. In the fall of 2022, a Bowie County jury heard the case. They listened to medical testimony about the nature of the wounds and the cause of death. They reviewed the online searches, the messages, the props, and the timeline. They heard from law enforcement and from people who had believed Parker's pregnancy was real. The trial record framed the act as both intimate and architectural, a killing designed to deliver a child to a woman who had none. The jury returned a verdict of guilty and, in November 2022, imposed a sentence of death. Parker was sent to Texas death row, where appeals will move through the courts for years. What shocks in this case is not only the level of violence, but also its cold order. The incision was deliberate. The removal was deliberate. The escape plan, even in its chaos, was deliberate. The lie asked the world to celebrate a birth, while a young mother bled out on her own floor. When the deception met the forensic record, it collapsed. The body told the truth. The house told the truth. The child's brief life told the truth. Texas recorded the judgment and closed the file on its facts. For Reagan Simmons Hancock and her unborn daughter, there is no remedy for Taylor Renee Parker. The law's sentence is fixed while the appellate machinery grinds forward bright lights, white walls, and a verdict that continues to echo this was murder for a child taken from the womb. Case 2. Kimberly Cargill. Kimberly Cargill lived a small radius life in East Texas work. Custody disputes, neighbors who knew her name. In 2010, that orbit crossed with a woman who helped her, from time to time, Cherry Walker, a 39-year-old neighbor with intellectual disabilities who occasionally babysat. Walker had been scheduled to speak to child protection authorities about Cargill's parenting. A date, a time, a voice the state intended to hear. Prosecutors would later say Cargill decided that voice would never reach the room. On the night of June 18, 2010, Cargill picked up Walker in Tyler, Smith County, Texas. The encounter was unremarkable to anyone watching two women in a car headed out into the humid dark. By the next morning, a passerby found a charred body dumped along a rural road outside Tyler. Fire crews doused what was left. Identification took time. Heat had erased detail. The killer counted on that. Dental records and the shape of what survived told investigators whose body it was. Cherry Walker would not testify. The medical examiner could not assign a single neat label to the exact mechanism of death. The fire had stolen too much. But the evidence, internal findings, the absence of soot in the airways, the circumstances pointed to homicidal violence before flames were applied. Prosecutors argued Cargill asphyxiated Walker by strangling or smothering, then set the body on fire to destroy evidence and buy time. It was not rage thrown in a moment. It was a plan designed to stop a witness. Investigators started close and widened. They mapped cell phone records and took statements from people who had seen the two women together that evening. They collected traces from Cargill's car and home cleaning attempts. Inconsistent explanations, timelines that wouldn't hold. The more they compared, the more the pattern answered back the pickup, the disappearance, the dump site, the accelerant, and the silence where a testimony should have been. Cargill tried to build an alibi out of errands and routine, but the phone pings and the clock on the road said otherwise. The motive made the case more chilling. Walker was vulnerable, an adult with limited capacity, known in the neighborhood for gentle habits and steady routines. She was also on the state's calendar. A CPS proceeding loomed in Texas. Killing a person to prevent testimony fits squarely inside the law's definition of capital murder. That was the theory the state brought to court, not only a homicide, but a homicide to obstruct justice. Cargill was arrested and indicted. In June 2012, a Smith County jury heard a trial built on physical evidence, digital records, and a through line of intimidation and control. Jurors saw photographs of the dump site and heard experts explain why fire could erase surfaces, but not the weight of pre-burn injuries or the logic of the scene. Witnesses described Walker's planned cooperation with authorities and Cargill's movements that night. The prosecution's picture was cold and simple. Stop the witness, burn the proof, move on. The verdict came back guilty of capital murder. The same jury considered punishment and returned the state's most severe sentence, death. Cargill was sent to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice Women's Death Row, where she remains. Appeals have followed the slow machinery that tests trial rulings and record sufficiency, but the core judgment stands. The law called it what it was, the killing of a witness to keep a system from hearing her speak. What shocks in this case is the target and the timing. Cherry Walker was scheduled to talk. She trusted the person who came to get her. The next morning, her body burned beside a Texas road. The fire was meant to erase identity. It did not erase intent. Jurors heard the geometry of the planned pickup: asphyxiation, fire, disposal, and the reason behind it silenced the testimony when the sentence was read. It recognized not only a murder, but an attack on the process that protects children and holds parents to account. East Texas remembers the smoke and the sirens. Court files remember the rest. A name on a docket, a date on a calendar, a life removed so a hearing wouldn't happen. In the record of Texas, Kimberly Cargill is the woman the jury said did that. Case 3. Brenda Delgado. Brenda Delgado didn't carry the gun. She carried the plan. In 2015 in Dallas, an on-again, Off-again relationship hardened into obsession. The new girlfriend was Dr. Kendra Hatcher, a 35-year-old pediatric dentist with a bright orbit and a regular schedule. Delgado learned the pattern when Hatcher finished clinic, where she parked, how the building's garage worked. Jealousy became logistics. Logistics became a contract. September 2nd, 2015. Dallas, early evening in Uptown. A Jeep shadows Hatcher's car into the apartment garage. Behind the wheel is Crystal Cortez. In the passenger seat sits Christopher Love, a dealer with a gun and a promise of cash. Hatcher steps out. Love closes the distance and fires a single round into the back of her head. The purse is taken to stage a robbery. The Jeep rolls out into city traffic. A murder is over in seconds. A conspiracy is just beginning to show. Dallas detectives start with what the garage gives them: cameras, angles, plate numbers. The Jeep is identified within hours. Then Cortez. In the interview room, she breaks. The story pours out. Delgado recruited her. Delgado hired Love. Delgado supplied the where and when. This wasn't a grudge in the dark. It was a murder for hire drawn in daylight with phones, meetings, and promises. Love is arrested. The net closes. And Delgado? She runs. Within weeks, she is in Mexico, moving between safe houses and family ties. The FBI adds her to the 10 most wanted, a rare slot for a woman, rarer still for a domestic murder. Wanted posters go bilingual, rewards climb. On the street in Mexico City, agents and local authorities make the grab in April 2016. Delgado is led away in handcuffs, and the case comes home slowly. Extradition takes time and conditions. Mexico will not return a suspect to face death. Texas agrees that no death penalty will be sought against Delgado. The case file is a clean diagram: a jealous ex-girlfriend, a hired gun, a getaway driver, text messages that map desire into instruction, reconnaissance trips near the building, a victim's schedule turned into an attack plan. Prosecutors refine it for a Dallas County jury. Cortez testifies. Digital forensics walks the panel through pings, calls, and routes. The garage footage plays again and again. Love's role is clear. Cortez's role is clear. Delgado's authorship is the point. She didn't pull the trigger, the state says, because she didn't need to. In June 2018, the jury decides guilty of capital murder as a party to a murder for hire, by law and by the extradition agreement. The sentence is life without parole. The shooter, Christopher Love, is tried separately and receives death in 2018. The driver, Crystal Cortez, pleads and is sentenced to a term of years. Delgado returns to a small cell, and a larger fact, once jealousy becomes a contract. There is no parole back to ordinary life. What shocks in this case is the precision. Delgado's consults, recruits, rehearses. She outsources the violence and keeps her hands clean. Trusting the market to supply a gunman, she builds a structure where another human being, young, accomplished, loved, is a task to be completed. The execution lasts seconds, but its components: money, surveillance, access, timing are the marks of something colder than rage. It's murder drawn on graph paper. Hatcher's colleagues speak of kindness, clinics for children, a laugh that filled rooms, that life ends under concrete lights because the wrong person could not accept that it had moved on. In the courtroom, the verdict carries the weight that the staged robbery tried to hide. This was planned. The law calls it capital murder. Dallas calls it by name. Years later, the garage cameras are still there. The ramp still curls to the street. People go on with their evenings, punch the key fob, park and walk. And somewhere in the files of the FBI and the Dallas County courts, there's a clean line drawn from a jealous thought to a single gunshot, a straight route from motive to action that left no way back. Case 4. Caitlin Marie Armstrong. Caitlin Marie Armstrong did not lash out in a moment. She built a vector jealousy into logistics. Logistics into violence. In Austin, Texas. Spring 22, she lived inside a complicated triangle that included elite gravel racer Mariah Mo Wilson and Armstrong's on-again, off-again partner, fellow pro cyclist Colin Strickland. Texts, sightings, and crossed schedules fed suspicion. Armstrong learned where Wilson stayed, when she returned, and how the apartment's quiet patterns worked. On May 11th, 22, she put that knowledge to use. It was evening in East Austin. Wilson, 25, had finished a training ride and dinner with a friend. She returned to a borrowed apartment, a safe in-between space before a race. Minutes later, neighbors would recall the sound they couldn't place. Inside, Wilson was shot multiple times at close range. There was no brawl, no negotiation. It was contact and finality. The shooter left the apartment as if erasing footsteps. Austin detectives moved quickly because the scene left lanes to follow. Surveillance cameras near the building captured an SUV looping the block at the right time. Databases and interviews tied that vehicle to Armstrong. Cell site data and digital traces narrowed the window further. Detectives reconstructed the night a target who returned home and a driver circling the area with purpose. What looked random from the street read as reconnaissance under a stopwatch. The motive the state presented was not abstract. It lived in messages, confrontations, and the way Armstrong tracked proximity. Wilson was a rising star, disciplined, fast, a favorite heading into big summer events. In the state's theory, that life became a threat to the control Armstrong wanted over a relationship unraveling in public. Jealousy turned into premeditation. Follow the schedule, find the window, then close it with a gun. Armstrong did not wait to be arrested. Within days, she was on the move. She sold her vehicle, left Texas, and flew east. In New York, she vanished into airport crowds and reappeared in a different country. By late June, she was in Costa Rica, on a surf town coastline crowded with travelers and cash-only rentals. When the U.S. Marshals and local authorities finally took her down on June 29, 22, she had altered her appearance and was living under a different story. She was extradited to Texas to face trial, in court. The case assembled itself like a clean diagram. Jurors saw video of the SUV, heard from ballistics and phone experts, and watched the timeline lock into place. Witnesses connected Armstrong's movements to Wilson's last hours. The defense challenged the state's inferences. The prosecution brought the line back to the garage cameras, the phone pings, and the flight out of the country. There was also an interlude that told its own story about intent during a medical appointment in October 23 while in custody. Armstrong tried to run. Deputies brought her down after a short chase. Control still mattered. The verdict came swift and heavy. In November 23, a Travis County jury found Armstrong guilty of murder. The judge imposed 90 years in prison. There is no execution here, no last statement. There is a long sentence and a record that reads, in the blunt language of Texas law, that one person hunted another over a private grievance and ended a world-class athlete's life with a handgun in a borrowed apartment. What shocks in this case is the precision surveillance before violence, closeness before shots, a flight across borders that felt less like panic and more like a continuation of the plan: new names, new places, the same need to get away. It is also the ordinariness of the setting: a quiet block, a normal door, a kitchen light still on. Wilson's friends talk about races, kindness, and a work ethic that made her hard to catch. The killer solved that problem by picking a room where speed didn't matter. Armstrong's capture in Costa Rica showed the limits of escape in a case built on cameras and timelines. Extradition returned her to the courthouse steps. A jury returned the law's answer. The file now sits with a sentence measured in decades, an asterisk for appeals, and a fixed narrative: jealousy converted to a schedule converted to death. Case 5. Kimberly Clark Syons. The room looked safe. White walls, humming machines, a clock that marked 4-hour sessions in calm minutes. Kimberly Clark Syons wore scrubs and an ID badge at the DaVita Dialysis Clinic in Lufkin, Angelina County, Texas. Patients came in on schedules, sat in recliners, and watched blood cycle through plastic lines, detoxified, returned, repeated. In April and May 2008, that routine began to fracture. Patients who had tolerated dialysis for years suddenly lurched into crisis nausea, burning in the chest, shortness of breath, alarm screaming. Some survived, others did not. What investigators later mapped had a pattern. Episodes clustered on Syons's shifts. The symptoms weren't random. They tracked exposure to a corrosive oxidizer in a unit that used bleach for surface disinfection. A nurse with access to the supply closet could reach for a bottle, a syringe, a line. Prosecutors would say that's exactly what happened, that Syons, a licensed professional, deliberately introduced bleach into the extracorporeal circuit where blood met plastic. turning a life-saving loop into a chemical weapon. The timeline formed quickly after red flags piled up. Staff noticed more machine alarms and clotted lines than usual when Sands was on duty. Some patients reported a bleachy taste during treatment. Housekeeping logs and chemical control sheets were pulled. Supervisors asked questions. Then the worst outcomes landed multiple deaths within a tight window. Patients who arrived for routine care and left under sheets. The clinic escalated. Law enforcement and state regulators arrived. The case moved from incident reports to a criminal investigation. Detectives did what good detectives do. They locked dosing schedules against worker rosters. They interviewed techs, nurses, and family members. They sent samples to labs. They listened when survivors described the burn in the throat, the way the room spun, the panic of trying to breathe while the pump kept pace. They learned which areas the cleaning crews hit with bleach and which areas bleach was never supposed to touch. The picture hardened. These weren't equipment malfunctions. This was human action. Sands had explanations. She had denials. She also had a problem. Coincidence doesn't stack neatly. The state built a case patient by patient, shift by shift. When the Angelina County grand jury issued indictments, they reflected the weight of that pattern: capital murder for multiple deaths and aggravated assaults for the survivors. The theory was clear intentional injection of bleach into vulnerable bloodlines. The motive was less fixed. The prosecution didn't have to prove why. They had to prove who and how. They argued impulse and control, a nurse who turned ordinary access into lethal opportunity. Trial began in the spring of 2012. Jurors heard forensic toxicology on bleach's interaction with blood and tissue. They heard about chlorine test strips, chain of custody, and machine logs. They watched the calendar line up the bad days, the staffing, the spike when Sands worked. Former patients described the moment the body went into revolt, how something that should have helped instead felt like it was killing them. The defense cross-examined on every gap other possible sources, handling errors, alternative medical explanations. The state kept bringing the lines back together. The verdict was a rotation back to first principles: trust violated. Science explained, law applied. The jury found Kimberly Clark Sands guilty of capital murder for killing multiple patients by injecting bleach and guilty on additional counts for assaulting others. Because the state did not seek death, the punishment for capital murder was life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the written record of Texas, the judgment reads in flat ink, but it points to a betrayal that still stings a nurse weaponizing the very system meant to keep fragile people alive. What shocks here is the method's intimacy. This wasn't a remote act or a gun in a parking lot. It was contact through a medical line, an attack that mimicked care. The clinic felt safe until it didn't. The victims were there because their kidneys could not protect them. They relied on staff to guard the thin boundary between treatment and harm. In that room, on those days, the boundary failed. There's a line prosecutors repeated that jurors seem to accept machines don't suddenly learn to cause the same rare crisis again and again on the same shifts. People do. Years later, the DaVita recliners are still there, and dialysis still saves lives. But in Texas law books and in the memories of families who went home without someone they loved, Kimberly Clark Sands is the figure who turned bleach into a blade. Case 6, Michelle Williams, in a tidy house in Keller, Tarrant County. The story was supposed to be simple: a break-in, a struggle, a husband dead. October 2011, night air, a call for help. But even on the first pass, the room didn't read like a robbery. It read like a script. Greg Williams lay in the master bedroom with a fatal gunshot wound. No chaos in the rest of the home, no frantic trail of flight. Things were disturbed but too neatly, in the wrong places, with the wrong kind of force, on the phone and in the hours after. Michelle Williams gave versions that shifted under their own weight: an intruder, a fight, and later, a suicide claim that forensics would not support. The smell of cleaners hung lightly in pockets of the room. Investigators logged it and moved on. The science closed in first: blood-stained geometry, transfer patterns, the absence of expected traces if a stranger had fought through the house, the presence of other traces if someone had cleaned, then staged. The event window, anchored by phones and movement, didn't match an outsider's timeline. A suicide would have left a different pattern trajectory. Residues, contact evidence. It didn't. The room kept saying the same thing. Someone rewrote it. In the days that followed, the picture sharpened. Detectives pulled text messages and phone logs. They interviewed friends and family about money problems, arguments, a marriage under stress. They asked about insurance and business. They listened to how Michelle explained the night and how often the details changed. They looked at the front door and the windows again. The so-called signs of forced entry that didn't track with force. Each thread was thin. The weave was not. What makes this case stand out in Texas isn't volume or body count. It's engineering the attempt to turn a domestic shooting into a crime by ghosts. To sell the idea that a predator crossed a suburban line, moved with surgical precision, shot a man, and vanished, leaving only props behind. Jurors later saw what the room had shown from minute one. The staging was the loudest thing in the house. The arrest came off a file that read, "Steady and clean." Michelle Williams was charged. Her statement stacked beside the forensic record. Prosecutors didn't spend time on dramatic theories. They put chronology on a big board and taught it to speak. Here is the minute the phone was dark. Here is the minute the body stopped making heat. Here is the minute the story changes. When the trial opened in 2016, the jury watched the timeline lock in place. They saw photographs that won't leave you the bed, the patterns on the wall, the marks that do not lie. They heard from experts who live in the small math of death scenes, and from neighbors who remember a night that was too quiet for what was claimed. The defense pressed the gaps. Could a stranger have slipped the net? Could a struggling man have taken his own life? The state walked the panel back to the room, the walls, the bed, the arc of the bullet, the residue that wasn't where it should be if a suicide had occurred. And then there was the story drift, the way versions multiplied as pressure rose. Juries don't like drift. They don't like rooms that have been wiped, either. The verdict landed hard, guilty. Not an accident, not a suicide, a homicide dressed up as a burglary. The sentence was measured not in months, but in decades, a long term that Texas papers commonly reported as 60 years. Williams left the courthouse to begin a life that shrinks to a schedule and a number. The system moved on to appeals and routine. The house in Keller went back to being a house. What shocks here is the audacity of the staging. It takes nerve to stand in a room with bleach in the air and declare a prowler's work. It takes calculation to push a narrative that fights the physics of blood and the arithmetic of time. In a way, this is the purest version of a certain kind of crime, the belief that a story can beat a scene. In Texas courtrooms, the scene usually wins. Greg Williams is a photograph, now smiles. Weekend light, small moments. He does not get the rest of his years. The law did what the law does. It wrote down the facts and fixed a punishment. The rest of us are left with the lesson the room keeps teaching, when an intruder appears only in the words of one person. Start with the evidence and listen to what it refuses to say. Case 7. Linda Carty. Linda Carty lived in Houston as a woman who wanted a baby and was running out of ways to pretend that one was coming. Prosecutors would later tell jurors that desire turned into architecture. Pick the target. Enter the home, remove the infant, and silence the mother. It was not an impulse. It was a plan. Night of May 16, 2001. A small apartment in Houston, Harris County, Texas. 25-year-old Joanna Rodriguez had just given birth. The baby was only a few days old, according to the state. Carty enlisted several men, went to the apartment under a pretext, and forced their way in. Tape, ties, orders barked in the dark. Rodriguez was bound, and the newborn was taken. The apartment fell back into silence, the kind that follows a surge of violence when there's no one left to shout. By morning, the outlines of what happened were visible to police. Evidence of restraint, witness accounts of intruders, a mother missing with her child. Investigators moved fast across the west side of Houston. Interviews, traffic cameras, phone records, convenience store receipts for duct tape and bags. Tips pointed back to Carty and the men around her. When officers finally found the car, the scene was a split of life and death, the infant alive, the mother dead, a plastic bag over her head, her body in the trunk. The medical examiner would later frame it in clinical terms, death by suffocation. The state's theory was blunt. Carty, they said, had posed as pregnant, talked about a delivery date, and targeted Rodriguez specifically because she had a newborn. If the plan worked, Carty would present the stolen baby as her own produce and infant to stabilize a failing relationship, and to live a lie that had already been rehearsed in words and props. It was, to use the prosecutor's line, murder to obtain a child. What made the case trial-ready was not just motive, it was structure. The accomplices tied themselves to Cardi and tied Cardi to the apartment. Phone records answered the where and when with indifferent clarity. Receipts and physical evidence tape, bags. Baby items closed gaps that stories might otherwise have slipped through. And the central fact would not move: the baby survived. The mother was dead in a car connected to Cardi's circle in February 2002 before a Harris County jury. Prosecutors laid out a clean chain recruitment: entry, restraint, suffocation, transport, recovery of the child. Witnesses placed Cardi at the core, not the hands that tightened the bag, the state said, but the mind that designed the night. The defense pressed weaknesses, credibility problems with cooperating witnesses, questions about investigative pressure, disputes about who did what inside the apartment and in the trunk. The jury returned to elements the law recognizes: kidnapping of a person, murder committed in the course of kidnapping, murder of a person taken to facilitate another felony. They found Linda Cardi guilty of capital murder. The punishment phase ended with death row. Years later, the case still carries arguments at the edges, claims about ineffective assistance, evidence handling, and international notification because Cardi is a British citizen. Appellate courts have reviewed and rejected core challenges. Clemency efforts have risen and receded. In the record that matters, the one Texas keeps, the conviction remains intact. There has been no execution date that survived the courts. There has been no relief that erased the verdict. What shocks here is the intimacy and the calculus. A new mother snatched from her own bed, a plastic bag pulled tight where there should have been breath and nursing and lullabies. A newborn recovered alive, a fact that saved one life while marking the end of another. If the plan had worked, a baby would simply appear in Cardi's home, and the world would be asked to clap for a miracle. Instead, the forensic record did what it always does when it's allowed to speak. It named the acts and mapped the route back to the person who organized them. In Texas, the statute has a phrase: capital murder in the course of kidnapping. The Rodriguez file is almost a definition written in real-time: abduction, suffocation, trunk, recovery. The verdict fixed the words to a person. The baby grew. The mother did not. The law took a long breath and wrote down what happened. Case 8, Melissa Lucio. Melissa Lucio's story begins under hard light interview room glare. A table between a mother and investigators asking why a 2-year-old is dead. South Texas, February 2007. A small apartment in Harlingen, poverty pressing on every wall, 12 children in the family, CPS in the background, days strung together with bills and noise. The child was Mariah, 2 years old, found unresponsive late on February 17, 2007. Paramedics saw bruising across her small body and carried her out. At the hospital, there was nothing left to do. The medical examiner would tell a jury that blunt force trauma to the head killed Mariah, and that the injuries on her body, bruises in various stages of healing, were consistent with ongoing physical abuse. That conclusion formed the spine of the state's case. This wasn't a single accident. It was a pattern, and it ended with a fatal blow. Prosecutors pointed to Lucio's own words, gathered after hours of interrogation by Texas Rangers. As proof that the story was as dark as the autopsy suggested, Lucio's lawyers countered with a different timeline. 2 days before the collapse, they said, Mariah fell down steep outdoor stairs. She began to limp, she slept, she vomited. The defense argued that a catastrophic internal injury missed in the chaos of a crowded home finally overwhelmed her. In this account, the bruises had explanations other than beating. The pattern the state saw was a mosaic of poverty, clumsiness, and prior CPS involvement, not a controlled campaign of violence. The interrogation, they said, produced a confession shaped by fatigue, grief, and pressure, not by guilt, in that room. The record shows Lucio denying that she beat the child. What the jurors watched, though, was a woman pregnant at the time of questioning pushed across hours, confronted with photos and assertions. At points she said she had spanked, that she was responsible as the mother, that she had bitten the child once. The statements are messy, inconsistent, and human. To the state, they were the outline of a confession. To the defense, They were the marks of a coerced, contamination-prone interview. The charge was capital murder, the venue Cameron County, Texas. In 2008, the case went to trial. Jurors heard from doctors, rangers, and family. They studied photos no one wants to see. The prosecution drew a straight line: a house full of children, a mother who lashed out, a child whose injuries could not be squared with stares. The defense struggled to disrupt that line, arguing fall-related trauma, lack of intent, and poor interrogation safeguards. The verdict arrived the way verdicts sometimes do in child death cases: quick and heavy. Guilty of capital murder, the same jury returned a death sentence. For years, the case seemed fixed, then it wasn't. Federal habeas litigation brought central questions into focus. Were experts for the defense wrongly curtailed? Did the trial court improperly limit testimony about false confessions? Did the state present or fail to correct misleading impressions about the medical evidence? A federal panel once granted relief. The Fifth Circuit, sitting en banc, later reinstated the conviction under AEDPA deference. Still, the questions kept circling the file. They landed hardest in April 22, with an execution date approaching. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay and remanded the case to the trial court to consider new evidence and legal claims, including whether junk science concerns infected the original trial, whether Brady material had been withheld, and whether testimony misled the jury. The stay did not declare Lucio innocent. It did something more uncomfortable: it announced uncertainty and ordered more scrutiny. As of now, Lucio has not been executed. The case remains under review in the Texas courts. What shocks here depends on where you stand. If you accept the autopsy and the interrogation at face value, the story is ruthless: a mother who beat a child over time and then delivered a final, fatal injury. If you accept the defense's model, it's a cautionary tale about tunnel vision, poverty, and interrogation dynamics, how trauma and exhaustion can shape words, and how medical certainty can harden too quickly. Both sides point to science. Both sides claim the moral high ground: justice for a child versus fairness for the accused. The facts no one disputes are the ones that matter most. Mariah is dead. The room she lived in is long cleared. The stairs outside that apartment still take a person down quickly if they miss their step. In a Harlingen file drawer and in Austin court servers. The case keeps moving: briefs, hearings, orders, because Texas insists that death sentences bear the weight of careful review. The headline today is "Spare, Melissa Lucio remains on Texas death row. Her 22 execution date was stayed. Litigation continues." The law is still asking her case the only honest question it has: are we sure? Case 9, Susan Wright, Houston, January 2003. A quiet master bedroom in Harris County turned into a killing ground. Susan Wright, then a 26-year-old mother of two, said she feared her husband, Jeff Wright. Prosecutors said she didn't fear him, she planned him. In the weeks before the attack, the marriage was collapsing under accusations, debt, and fights that neighbors could hear through the walls. One night, the argument stopped. What followed was not an argument. Inside that room, Jeff was restrained on the bed, wrists and ankles secured, while a knife flashed again and again. Forensics would later count 193 stab wounds: chest, neck, head, arms, legs, back, hands. The pattern told a story of proximity and time: wounds delivered from close range, defensive cuts on hands that came up too late, blood spatter that mapped arcs across drywall and fabric. After the stabbing, the scene changed character. The bed was stripped, the mattress moved. Portions of the room were cleaned and repainted. In the backyard, a shallow grave was dug. Jeff's body was buried in soil that had never been turned that way before. The next day, Susan took the children to her mother's house and told relatives that Jeff had left after a fight. She later filed for a protective order, describing abuse and fear. On paper, it read like a battered spouse narrative. Inside the house, the room still spoke: diluted blood in cracks where bleach missed, transfer stains where a mattress had been carried, tool marks in the yard where earth had been opened and closed. Days passed. Jeff's family pressed police. When the grave was found, the deception ended. Detectives replayed the night by evidence: the tie-downs, the number and distribution of wounds, the post-crime staging cleanup, paint, concealment. Susan's explanation was self-defense against years of battering she said Jeff attacked and threatened her, that she tied him down during sex at his request, that the stabbing was panic and survival. Prosecutors countered with premeditation, a controlled immobilization, a prolonged assault, deliberate concealment, and a false he just left cover story to them. The claim of self-defense collapsed against the geometry of the scene. In February 2004, a Harris County jury heard a trial that became Texas courtroom lore. Prosecutors reconstructed the bed inside the courtroom to show how a bound man could be trapped for hours. Jurors saw autopsy photos and diagrams pinpointing each wound. They heard experts explain why the spatter and trajectories contradicted a sudden frenzy. The defense called witnesses and painted a life of domestic violence, arguing that fear makes people do things that look calculated to outsiders. The jury deliberated and returned guilty of murder. The judge imposed 25 years in prison. That could have been the end. It wasn't. In 2009, a Texas appellate court ordered a new punishment hearing, finding error that had limited how the defense presented abuse evidence. The 2010 re-sentencing brought more testimony about injuries, threats, and control inside the marriage. The jury adjusted the number 20 years, a decade later, after serving the required portion of that term. Susan Wright was paroled in 20, placed under supervision with conditions. The conviction stands, the sentence stands modified, not erased. What shocks here is the intimacy in the volume, 193. It is a number a juror will never forget. The prosecution said it measured intent, the defense said it measured terror. Both sides asked the jury to decide what a bedroom can become when love turns into inventory of wounds, lies, repairs, and graves. The court's answer was not perfect the first time, so Texas asked it again. The second answer was different, but only at the edges. Today, the case lives in two parallel files. In the legal file, it is a murder with a trial, an appeal, a resentencing, and a parole. In the cultural file, it became the media shorthand, blue-eyed butcher. Labels are easy, rooms are not. If you walk backward through this one, past the fresh paint, past the stripped bed, past the hole in the yard, you arrive at a choice: tie a man down and end his life. Then bury the evidence and try to write a safer story. Texas read the room and wrote another story instead: murder. Case 10, Celeste Beard Johnson. Austin's hills go quiet after midnight in Westlake Hills. The quiet broke at 3 a.m., October 1999. Stephen Beard, a wealthy, retired television executive in his 70s, lay in his bed when a shotgun blast tore through a sliding glass door and struck him in the abdomen. He did not die that night. Surgeons fought, he stabilized. Then months later, January 2000, he died of complications. Prosecutors would tie directly back to that single shot. The house showed no signs of robbery. The door was the point of entry and the weapon's path. Whoever did this came for him. Celeste Beard Johnson was in her mid-30s, then born 1963. Living in Austin with her twin daughters and the much older husband whose name carried money and access. They had met years earlier when she was working service in Austin's social orbit. Within months, the addresses and bank accounts changed. The marriage, witnesses said, was volatile: spending sprees, fights, separations threatened and withdrawn. After the shooting, Celeste told friends Stephen was cruel, that she was trapped. She also kept spending. The prosecution would later ask jurors to look at motive not as a mystery, but as arithmetic: money, lifestyle, control, and to look at means as outsourced violence. The shooter's name surfaced: Tracy Tarleton. She and Celeste had met earlier in '99 while both were patients at a psychiatric facility in Austin. They grew close and tense, fast, secretive. Tarleton would eventually testify that Celeste cultivated the relationship, fed her stories that Stephen was abusive, promised a future together, and pushed for the killing. Tarleton admitted she took the shotgun to Westlake Hills that night and fired through the glass. For months, she refused to implicate Celeste. The state tried her first. Pressure and leverage did what pressure does. By the time Celeste went to trial, Tarleton was the linchpin witness, tying intent to the woman who never pulled the trigger. Detectives didn't rely only on a cooperator. They mapped timelines where Celeste was, what she bought, what she said. They traced financial records. noting how quickly spending accelerated both before and after the shooting. They examined the house, the straight-line path from the yard to the bed, the angle of pellets and glass. A shot fired by someone who knew exactly where Stephen slept. They listened to Celeste's post-shooting narratives, how often she moved between fear and performative relief, how she pitched herself to friends as newly free, how she escalated spending even as Stephen lay in long-term care. It wasn't a single piece, it was a mesh. Trial opened in March 2003 in Travis County. The state laid out the murder by proxy theory. Celeste manipulated Tarleton. Tarleton pulled the trigger, and Stephen's eventual death converted a botched burglary fable into homicide. Jurors watched medical experts connect post-operative embolism and complications to the abdominal shotgun wound, the legal bridge between October and January. They saw where the shot came through the glass, heard about Tarleton's movements that night, and read the money trail Celeste left behind. The defense attacked Tarleton's credibility, emphasized her mental health history, argued that she acted alone, and painted Celeste as a liar perhaps, but not a killer. The verdict was not ambiguous. Guilty of murder, the sentence life in prison. With parole eligibility after 40 years under Texas law, the judge's numbers gave the public an easy translation. This was not capital murder. There would be no death row, but the earliest door would not open until 2043. Appeals and habeas followed. None vacated the core judgment. In the Texas system's flat prose, Celeste Beard Johnson moved from defendant to inmate, her case cited in classrooms and true crime segments as the template for murder by manipulation. What shocks here isn't the exotic, it's the ordinary turned lethal. A bedroom, a glass door, a single shot that waits months to finish its work. The prosecution's story is as old as money inheritance. Leverage, a proxy willing to carry the gun. The defense's story is as old as betrayal, a spurned lover lying to save herself. Jurors chose the first, in Austin. People still remember the way that house sits on its slope, and how the shot sliced a clean geometry from the yard to the bed. The law remembers more. It wrote down the date, the wound, the death, and the person it says authored the night. Years pass. The twins are adults. The Westlake address belongs to other lives. In the file, nothing moves except appeal deadlines. What remains is a model of how premeditation can wear a friendly face, and how a hand that never touched a weapon can still be the one the state names as the killer. You've just discovered 10 chilling Texas cases: Taylor Renee Parker, Kimberly Cargill, Brenda Delgado, Caitlin Marie Armstrong, Kimberly Clark Syens, Michelle Williams, Linda Carty, Melissa Lucio, Susan Wright, and Celeste Beard Johnson. Women trusted as partners, neighbors, caregivers, yet planning murder with care. Who sent chills down your spine the most? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more shocking true crime stories like this, hit like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Remember, the quietest rooms can hide the loudest crimes.